In the summer of 1980, a luxury hotel in downtown Kansas City became the epicenter of one of the most devastating structural collapses in American history. But what the headlines never revealed was that beneath the twisted steel and concrete, something else had been buried, something worth $4.2 million that vanished without explanation. For 43 years, that secret remained entombed under layers of debris and silence. Until last month, when a construction drone scanning the redevelopment site captured images that would crack open a mystery the city had forgotten. The Grandview Plaza Hotel stood as a monument to 1970s architectural ambition. 22 stories of gleaming glass and polished marble, it dominated the Kansas City skyline with the kind of bold confidence that defined the era. Opened in 1976, the hotel catered to business executives, political figures, and wealthy travelers who demanded luxury without compromise. Its grand ballroom hosted charity galas and corporate events. The penthouse suite commanded views that stretched to the horizon. By all appearances, the Grandview was a symbol of prosperity and permanence. But beneath that polished exterior, structural engineers would later discover, lay a foundation built on shortcuts and compromised materials. The hotel's collapse on August 14, 1980, wasn't just a tragedy that claimed 47 lives. It was the catastrophic end result of construction decisions made years earlier, when profit margins mattered more than safety protocols. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The morning of the collapse began like any other. The hotel's restaurant served breakfast to traveling salesmen and conference attendees. The lobby bustled with guests checking out after overnight stays. Housekeeping staff moved through the upper floors, preparing rooms for the next wave of arrivals. At 11:47 a.m., without warning, the building's central support structure buckled. What followed was 43 seconds of catastrophic failure that reduced 22 stories to a mountain of rubble. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the scale of destruction was unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. Entire floors had pancaked together, creating a compressed mass of concrete, steel, and human tragedy. The rescue operation lasted for weeks, with crews working around the clock to locate survivors trapped in air pockets deep within the debris. By the time the last body was recovered, the official death toll stood at 47, with dozens more injured. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of negligence that stretched back to the hotel's original construction. Substandard concrete had been used in critical load-bearing elements. Steel reinforcements had been installed incorrectly. Safety inspections had been rushed or falsified entirely. The Grandview Plaza Hotel hadn't just collapsed. It had been destined to fail from the moment construction began. But amid the lawsuits, insurance claims, and criminal investigations, one detail slipped through the cracks. The hotel's general manager, Robert Kellerman, had reported significant cash holdings in the building's main vault on the morning of the collapse. These weren't ordinary hotel revenues. According to internal memos recovered months later, the vault contained $4.2 million in currency that had been temporarily stored pending transfer to a regional banking facility. The money had arrived 3 days before the collapse, transported in armored vehicles under federal escort. It was part of a complex financial arrangement involving several Midwest banks that were consolidating their cash reserves during a period of economic uncertainty. The Grandview's vault, with its advanced security systems and central location, had been selected as a temporary holding facility. The transfer was scheduled for August 15th, one day after the building came down. When rescue crews finally reached the vault's location deep within the wreckage, they found twisted metal and pulverized concrete. The massive steel door had been crushed beyond recognition. The interior chamber was filled with debris and contaminated water from broken pipes, but the money was gone, not destroyed, not buried under rubble, simply absent, as if it had never existed at all. Federal investigators combed through every piece of recoverable evidence. They interviewed bank officials, armored car personnel, and hotel employees who had survived the collapse. They traced serial numbers and examined financial records with microscopic precision. The conclusion was as baffling as it was definitive. The $4.2 million had vanished completely, leaving behind no trace of its existence beyond the paperwork documenting its arrival. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that the vault's security system had been disabled 2 hours before the collapse. Surveillance cameras had gone offline, alarm sensors had been deactivated, and access logs showed no record of authorized entry. Someone with intimate knowledge of the system had deliberately compromised the vault's defenses, but with the hotel's security staff either dead or severely injured, finding answers proved impossible. Insurance companies launched their own investigations, hiring private security firms and forensic accountants to trace the missing funds. They examined every financial transaction connected to the hotel in the weeks leading up to the collapse. They interviewed construction workers, maintenance personnel, and anyone who had access to the building's restricted areas. The investigation consumed months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It yielded nothing. Theories emerged and were quickly discredited. Some suggested the money had been incinerated in fires that erupted during the collapse. Others proposed that it had been buried so deeply under debris that recovery was impossible. A few investigators quietly speculated about inside involvement, but without evidence or suspects, these theories remained just that. Speculation. The case was officially suspended in 1983, though it was never formally closed. The insurance payouts were processed, the legal settlements were reached, and Kansas City moved forward with the painful work of rebuilding. The site where the Grandview Plaza Hotel once stood remained vacant for years, a fenced lot that served as an unofficial memorial to those who had died. Over time, the missing money became a footnote in the larger tragedy. Local newspapers occasionally revisited the story on anniversary dates, but public interest waned as new crises captured attention. The $4.2 million joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries that pepper American history, cases that generate headlines briefly before disappearing into archives and forgotten files. But mysteries, even buried ones, have a way of resurfacing when conditions align. Time erodes cover-ups, exposes lies, and reveals truths that once seemed permanently hidden. Sometimes it takes decades for the right combination of technology, circumstance, and simple luck to bring answers to light. In the case of the Grandview Plaza Hotel, that combination finally emerged in the form of a construction drone conducting routine site surveys for a planned redevelopment project. The lot had been purchased by a commercial real estate firm with plans to build a mixed-use complex featuring retail space, offices, and residential units. Before breaking ground, the developers commissioned detailed topographical and structural surveys to identify any remaining debris or underground hazards. The drone, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and high-resolution imaging systems, began its systematic scan of the property on a clear morning in September. Its mission was straightforward: map the subsurface conditions and identify anything that might complicate construction. What it discovered instead was evidence of something that had been hidden beneath 43 years of silence and secrecy. The images captured by the drone revealed anomalies in the soil composition that didn't match the expected debris patterns from the hotel collapse. Geometric shapes buried at specific depths suggested deliberate placement rather than random distribution. Most intriguingly, the radar detected what appeared to be intact containers or boxes arranged in a grid pattern approximately 15 feet below the surface. These weren't construction materials or building remnants. They were too uniform, too precisely positioned to be accidental, Someone had buried something in this location with careful planning and execution. And given the site's history, the timing of that burial became the key question that would reopen a case the city thought was closed forever. The construction team initially dismissed the drone's findings as equipment malfunction. Ground-penetrating radar, they reasoned, often produced false readings when scanning areas with complex debris patterns. The Grandview site had been notorious for its chaotic underground landscape, where twisted steel beams and concrete chunks created interference that could fool even advanced detection systems. But when 3 separate scans conducted over 2 weeks yielded identical results, skepticism gave way to curiosity. The development firm's project manager, Sarah Chen, had overseen dozens of urban construction projects throughout her career. She understood the importance of thorough site preparation and the costly delays that unexpected discoveries could create. But she also recognized that the radar signatures didn't match anything in her experience. The buried objects appeared too organized, too deliberately placed to be remnants of the 1980 collapse. Chen contacted the Kansas City Municipal Archives to request historical records of the Grandview site. What she found was a surprisingly thin file, considering the magnitude of the disaster that had occurred there. The official investigation reports were heavily redacted, with entire sections blacked out under various legal and insurance protections. Construction records from the original hotel showed routine excavation and foundation work, but nothing that would explain the geometric patterns detected by the drone. More troubling was the absence of comprehensive debris removal documentation. After the collapse, cleanup crews had worked for months to clear the site, yet the archived reports contained only summary statements about tonnage removed and disposal locations. There were no detailed inventories, no photographs of the excavation process, and no maps showing where specific materials had been recovered or left in place. The gap in documentation raised questions that extended beyond mere bureaucratic oversight. Major disaster sites typically generated extensive paper trails, with every aspect of the recovery and cleanup process meticulously recorded for legal and insurance purposes. The Grandview site files looked more like those of a routine demolition than the scene of one of the city's worst structural failures. Chen's inquiries eventually reached the desk of Detective Marcus Webb, a veteran investigator with the Kansas City Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Webb had joined the department in 1985, 5 years after the hotel collapse, but he was familiar with the case through departmental lore and training materials. The missing $4.2 million had become something of a legend within law enforcement circles, a reminder of how even the most thoroughly investigated crimes could leave essential questions unanswered. When Webb reviewed the drone survey results alongside the original case files, patterns began to emerge that earlier investigators had missed. The vault's location within the hotel structure placed it in the building's northeast corner, approximately 20 feet below street level. The drone's radar anomalies were concentrated in the same general area, though displaced laterally by roughly 30 feet from the vault's original position. The displacement suggested movement, but not the random scattering that would result from a catastrophic collapse. Instead, the detected objects appeared to have been relocated with precision, as if someone had deliberately moved them from their original location to a carefully chosen burial site. The implications were staggering. If the radar signatures represented the missing money, then someone had not only stolen it, but had also possessed the resources and opportunity to bury it beneath tons of collapsed debris. Webb requested permission to conduct a limited excavation at the site. The developer, eager to resolve any potential complications before construction began, agreed to fund a preliminary dig focused on the most promising radar targets. A small crew was assembled, consisting of forensic archaeologists, structural engineers, and evidence technicians trained in the recovery of buried materials. The excavation began on a cold October morning, with hydraulic equipment carefully removing layers of soil and debris that had accumulated over 4 decades. The work proceeded slowly, with each shovelful of earth photographed and catalogued before removal. At 8 feet below the surface, the crew encountered the first layer of building debris, a compressed mass of concrete, steel, and glass that confirmed the site's tragic history. But beneath that layer, in soil that showed signs of deliberate excavation and replacement, they found something that transformed speculation into evidence. The first object was a waterproof metal container, approximately 2 feet long and 18 inches wide, buried with its corners aligned to magnetic north. The precision of its placement was unmistakable. This wasn't debris that had settled randomly during the collapse. It was cargo that had been interred with military-like accuracy. The container was extracted intact and transported to a secure facility for examination. X-ray imaging revealed dense, uniform contents consistent with bundled currency. When the seal was finally broken under controlled conditions, investigators found themselves staring at stacks of cash that had remained pristine despite 4 decades underground. The bills were wrapped in plastic sheeting and organized by denomination, exactly as they would have been for bank transport. Serial number analysis confirmed what everyone suspected but hardly dared believe. This was part of the missing $4.2 million from the Grandview Plaza Hotel vault. The money hadn't been destroyed in the collapse or lost to the chaos of the rescue operation. It had been systematically removed, carefully packaged, and buried beneath the disaster site with the confidence that no one would ever think to look there. The discovery prompted an immediate expansion of the excavation. If one container had survived burial, others were likely nearby, arranged in the grid pattern detected by the drone. Over the following weeks, the dig revealed a total of 12 containers, each positioned with the same geometric precision and containing similar quantities of preserved currency. As the containers were opened and their contents verified, the scope of the operation became clear. Someone hadn't just stumbled upon an opportunity to steal money during the confusion of the collapse. They had orchestrated a sophisticated theft that used the tragedy as cover for one of the most audacious heists in American history. The planning required intimate knowledge of the hotel's security systems, the vault's contents, and the chaos that would follow the building's failure. But perhaps most remarkably, the thief had possessed enough foresight to create a long-term storage solution that could survive decades without detection. The burial site was chosen not just for concealment, but for preservation, with the soil conditions that would protect the currency from moisture and decay. This wasn't the work of opportunistic criminals. It was the product of methodical planning by someone who understood that patience could transform theft into permanent possession. The investigation that had been dormant for over 40 years suddenly exploded back to life with new urgency and purpose. Federal agents were called in to assist with the financial analysis, while forensic teams began the painstaking process of examining every container for trace evidence that might identify the perpetrators. What they found would prove that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces that time cannot erase. And those traces would lead investigators not just to the identity of the thief, but to a conspiracy that reached far deeper into the Grandview Hotel disaster than anyone had ever imagined. The forensic examination of the buried containers revealed details that painted a picture of meticulous preparation, extending far beyond the night of the collapse. Each metal box bore manufacturing stamps indicating they had been purchased from a specialized security equipment supplier in St. Louis during the spring of 1980, months before the tragedy. The plastic sheeting used to wrap the currency was a military-grade material typically reserved for long-term storage in harsh environments. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into creating the perfect preservation system. More intriguingly, soil analysis around the burial site showed evidence of excavation that had occurred not during the chaotic aftermath of the collapse, but in the weeks immediately preceding it. Chemical traces in the earth indicated the presence of heavy machinery, specifically a compact excavator of the type used in urban construction projects. The machine had been operated during nighttime hours, based on the pattern of soil compaction and the absence of any witness reports from the period. This discovery fundamentally altered the investigation's timeline. The theft hadn't been a crime of opportunity executed during the confusion of the disaster. It had been planned and prepared for months in advance, with the burial site excavated and ready before the hotel ever collapsed. Someone had known exactly when and how the Grandview Plaza would fail, and they had positioned themselves to capitalize on that knowledge. Detective Webb assembled a task force that included federal investigators, forensic accountants, and structural engineers who had worked on the original collapse investigation. Their first priority was re-examining the hotel's construction records and safety inspection reports, searching for any indication of deliberate sabotage or advanced knowledge of structural weaknesses. What they uncovered was a web of corruption that had been overlooked during the initial investigation's focus on negligence and cost-cutting. The hotel's construction had been overseen by Meridian Engineering, a firm that specialized in large commercial projects throughout the Midwest. But buried in Meridian's personnel records was a connection that had never been explored. The company's lead structural engineer, David Ashford, had a brother named Thomas, who worked as a security consultant for several major banks, including the consortium that had arranged the temporary storage of funds at the Grandview. Thomas Ashford's employment records showed that he had been intimately involved in planning the cash transfer that brought $4.2 million to the hotel vault. He had conducted security assessments of the facility, reviewed the vault's specifications, and even participated in discussions about the timing of the money's arrival and departure. His access to this information would have given him precise knowledge of when the maximum amount of cash would be present in the building. More damning was the discovery that Thomas Ashford had taken an unusual leave of absence from his security consulting job in July 1980, citing family health concerns. During this period, his whereabouts were largely unaccounted for, with only sporadic appearances at his Kansas City apartment and no verifiable employment or travel records. The investigation into David Ashford revealed an equally suspicious pattern. As Meridian Engineering's senior structural engineer, he had been responsible for the final safety assessments that cleared the Grandview for occupancy. His reports, filed in late 1979 and early 1980, had consistently minimized concerns about the building's structural integrity, despite numerous red flags identified by junior engineers on his team. Internal memos recovered from Meridian's archived files showed that David Ashford had overruled recommendations for additional steel reinforcement, dismissed warnings about concrete quality issues, and expedited approval processes that normally required weeks of review. His colleagues had raised concerns about his decisions, but their objections had been documented and then apparently ignored by company management. The pattern suggested that David Ashford hadn't simply made poor engineering judgments. He had systematically weakened the building's structural integrity while maintaining plausible deniability about his actions. Each decision could be explained as cost-cutting or schedule pressure, but collectively they created the conditions that would lead to catastrophic failure. Federal agents obtained warrants to search for any surviving records from both Ashford brothers' personal and professional activities during 1980. What they found was a careful campaign to eliminate evidence of their involvement. David Ashford had died in a car accident in 1987, and his personal papers had been disposed of by relatives who saw no reason to preserve old work documents. Thomas Ashford had relocated to Arizona in 1982 and had died of natural causes in 1994, again leaving behind no relevant documentation. But modern investigative techniques revealed traces that the brothers couldn't have anticipated. Digital analysis of surviving Meridian Engineering computer files, stored on obsolete magnetic tapes, uncovered draft reports that David Ashford had written but never submitted. These documents painted a starkly different picture of the Grandview's structural condition, acknowledging serious deficiencies that made catastrophic failure not just possible but inevitable. The draft reports included detailed calculations showing that the building's central support columns were insufficient to handle the designed load capacity. They identified specific vulnerabilities in the foundation that would lead to progressive collapse under certain stress conditions. Most remarkably, they included timeline estimates suggesting that structural failure would occur between 18 and 24 months after the building's opening, placing the predicted collapse squarely in the summer of 1980. These suppressed reports provided the smoking gun that investigators had been seeking. David Ashford hadn't just known that the Grandview would collapse. He had engineered its failure through a series of design decisions that appeared legitimate on the surface but were actually calculated to ensure disaster. His brother Thomas had used advanced knowledge of both the building's vulnerability and the scheduled cash transfer to position himself for the theft of a lifetime. The scope of their conspiracy became even clearer when investigators traced the ownership of the compact excavator that had been used to prepare the burial site. The machine had been rented through a shell company registered under a false name, but payment records showed it had been funded through a series of cash transactions that began in March 1980. The rental period extended from June through September, covering both the pre-collapse excavation and the post-collapse burial operations. Security camera footage from a nearby construction supply company, preserved in archives that had never been digitized, showed a man matching Thomas Ashford's description, purchasing the waterproof containers and military-grade plastic sheeting used to preserve the stolen money. The purchases had been made over several weeks, with different locations used to avoid attracting attention. The level of planning demonstrated patience and sophistication that went far beyond typical criminal enterprise. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was evidence that the Ashford brothers had researched the hotel's occupancy patterns to minimize casualties while maximizing chaos. Internal hotel records showed that August 14th had been selected for a major conference cancellation, reducing the number of guests in the building by nearly 60%. The collapse had been timed for late morning, when most remaining guests would be in the lobby or restaurant areas rather than in the upper floors that suffered the most catastrophic damage. This calculation suggested that while the brothers were willing to cause a disaster for financial gain, they had made efforts to limit the loss of life. The 47 people who died were not incidental to their plan, but they represented a compromise between creating sufficient chaos to cover the theft and avoiding the kind of mass casualty event that would trigger the most intensive federal investigation. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of criminals who operated with a twisted moral code. They saw themselves not as murderers but as sophisticated thieves who had found a way to steal millions while minimizing harm. The collapse was regrettable, but necessary collateral damage in service of a greater financial objective. As investigators pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy, they realized they were dealing with one of the most elaborate heists in American criminal history. The Ashford brothers had spent over a year planning every detail, from weakening the building's structure to timing the cash transfer to preparing the burial site that would hide their proceeds for decades. The theft had required expertise in structural engineering, security systems, heavy equipment operation, and long-term storage techniques. It had demanded access to confidential banking information, construction records, and hotel operational data. Most remarkably, it had required the patience to wait over 40 years for the perfect opportunity to recover the buried fortune, but that patience had ultimately proven to be their downfall. The same meticulous planning that had made the theft possible had also created a permanent record of their involvement, preserved in soil samples, purchase records, and digital archives that modern forensic techniques could decode decades after the fact. The investigation had evolved from a simple property survey into a complex federal case involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. What had begun as a routine construction project had uncovered evidence of premeditated murder, grand theft, and conspiracy that reached back over 4 decades. And as investigators continued to excavate both the burial site and the documentary evidence surrounding the case, they began to suspect that the Ashford brothers' conspiracy might have extended even further than they had initially imagined. The precision of their planning suggested connections and resources that went beyond what 2 individuals could have managed alone. The question now was whether the buried money represented the complete scope of their theft, or whether it was merely the portion they had been unable to access safely in the years following the collapse. If additional accomplices had been involved, other caches might exist, hidden in locations that would require entirely different investigative approaches to uncover. The case that had begun with the construction drone's routine survey was rapidly becoming one of the most complex criminal investigations in the region's history. And with each new discovery, it became increasingly clear that the full truth about the Grandview Plaza Hotel collapse was far more sinister than anyone had ever suspected. The recovery of the buried money marked the beginning rather than the end of a much larger investigation. As federal agents counted and cataloged the preserved currency, they made a discovery that transformed their understanding of the entire operation. Of the $4.2 million that had vanished from the Grandview vault, only $3.1 million had been buried at the site. Nearly $1 million remained unaccounted for, suggesting that the Ashford brothers had either spent portions of their haul or hidden additional caches elsewhere. Financial records from the months following the collapse revealed subtle but telling patterns. Thomas Ashford had made several large cash purchases in late 1980 and early 1981, including a luxury boat registered under his wife's maiden name and real estate investments in remote areas of Missouri and Arkansas. These transactions had been structured to avoid banking regulations, but they left paper trails that modern forensic accounting could trace. More intriguingly, investigators discovered that David Ashford had established a trust fund for his children just weeks before the hotel collapse. The fund had been seeded with $200,000 in cash, an amount that far exceeded his legitimate income as a structural engineer. The timing and funding source of this trust raised obvious questions about advance planning and the disposition of stolen proceeds. The investigation expanded to include family members and associates who might have unknowingly benefited from the conspiracy. David Ashford's widow, now in her 80s and living in a retirement community in Florida, was questioned about her late husband's financial activities during 1980. Her responses painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly secretive and paranoid in the months leading up to the collapse. She recalled that David had insisted on installing an expensive home security system and had begun keeping large amounts of cash in a bedroom safe. He had spoken vaguely about a major project that would secure their family's financial future, but he had refused to provide details even when pressed. In retrospect, his behavior suggested someone carrying the psychological burden of planning a mass casualty event for personal gain. Thomas Ashford's surviving relatives provided similar accounts of unusual behavior and unexplained wealth. His daughter remembered her father taking the family on an expensive European vacation in 1981, paying for everything in cash and displaying an uncharacteristic disregard for cost. He had claimed the money came from a successful consulting contract, but no records of such work existed in his professional files. The investigation also revealed that both brothers had taken steps to distance themselves from Kansas City in the years following the collapse. David had requested a transfer to Meridian Engineering's Denver office, citing family reasons. Thomas had terminated his security consulting contracts and moved to Arizona, where he established a new identity working in real estate development under his middle name. This pattern of relocation and reinvention suggested guilty knowledge and a desire to escape scrutiny. But it also indicated that the brothers had expected their crime to eventually be discovered. Their long-term planning extended beyond the theft itself, to include strategies for avoiding prosecution and living with the proceeds of their conspiracy. As investigators traced the brothers' movements and financial activities through the 1980s and beyond, they began to understand the full psychological toll of their crime. Neither man had ever lived comfortably with what they had done. Both had suffered from anxiety and depression in their later years, according to medical records and family accounts. They had achieved financial security through murder and theft, but they had never found peace. The discovery of the buried money also prompted a comprehensive review of other unsolved crimes from the same era. Federal databases were searched for similar patterns of structural sabotage, inside information, and elaborate concealment schemes. The sophistication of the Ashford conspiracy suggested that it might not have been their first criminal enterprise, or that similar groups might have operated elsewhere using comparable methods. This broader investigation uncovered several suspicious building failures from the late 1970s and early 1980s, including a shopping mall collapse in Ohio and a bridge failure in Texas. While none showed the same clear evidence of deliberate sabotage, the timing and circumstances raised questions about whether a larger network of corrupt engineers and security professionals might have been operating during this period. The possibility of a wider conspiracy remained speculative, but it highlighted the vulnerability of America's infrastructure to insider threats. The Ashford case demonstrated how individuals with specialized knowledge and access could exploit public trust for enormous personal gain, using disasters as cover for crimes that might otherwise be impossible to execute. As the investigation drew toward its conclusion, federal prosecutors faced the challenge of seeking justice for crimes committed by men who had died decades earlier. While criminal charges were impossible, civil remedies remained available. The recovered money was returned to the insurance companies that had paid out claims following the original theft, along with interest and penalties that brought the total recovery to over $5 million. More importantly, the case prompted significant reforms in building inspection procedures and financial security protocols. The vulnerabilities that the Ashford brothers had exploited were systematically addressed through new regulations and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. The families of the 47 people who died in the Grandview Plaza collapse were finally provided with answers they had sought for over 4 decades. While justice in the traditional sense remained elusive, the truth about their loved ones' deaths brought a measure of closure that had long been denied. The construction site where the hotel once stood was transformed into a memorial park, with a monument honoring those who died and acknowledging the complex truth of what had really happened there. The mixed-use development project was relocated to an adjacent lot, allowing the original site to serve as a permanent reminder of both tragedy and the eventual triumph of truth over deception. The case of the Grandview Plaza Hotel became a landmark study in forensic investigation, demonstrating how modern technology and persistent detective work could solve even the most elaborate crimes from decades past. The construction drone that had made the initial discovery was credited with breaking open one of the most sophisticated conspiracies in American criminal history. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler and more profound. The Ashford brothers had believed that time would bury their crime as completely as they had buried their stolen fortune. They had counted on death, distance, and the fading of memory to protect them from consequences. Instead, they learned that truth has its own patience, and that even the most carefully planned deceptions eventually crumble under the weight of evidence and the persistence of those who refuse to let injustice remain hidden. The $4.2 million that vanished in 1980 had finally been found, along with the full story of how it disappeared. And in that discovery, 47 victims received the justice they deserved, even if it came 4 decades too late.